The Crown announcement. The river that offers no escape. Edward walking alone through London. Cecil Court bookshop. Shuffling the pigeon.
Edward sees Clara for the first.
The morning they told Prince Edward James Ashford that he would be king before summer, he was standing barefoot on the cold marble floor of his private study at Kensington Palace, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, staring at the Thames below as though the river might offer him an escape route. It did not. What it offered instead, 3 weeks later on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled of rain and old books, was a woman named Clara Hensley, standing outside a second-hand bookshop on Cecil Court, arguing loudly with a pigeon over a stolen scone. He should have walked past her. He really should have. But Edward James Ashford had been walking past things his entire life, past laughter, past freedom, past the version of himself that existed before royal duty had ironed every crease of personality out of him, and for the first time in 31 years, his feet simply refused to cooperate. That was Tuesday. By Friday, he was in love. By Sunday, his world was on fire. Nobody tells you what it actually feels like to be next in line for the British throne. They tell you about the history, centuries of it, pressed into every painting on every corridor wall of every palace you've ever called home. They tell you about the duty, the service, the legacy. They hand you books written by men who never had to live any of it. They dress you in uniforms stitched together from tradition and expectation. And they smile warmly while doing it, as if the weight you're carrying is something to be proud of rather than something quietly crushing. But no one ever sits you down as a boy and says, "Edward, one day you will wake up and realize that you have never, not once, made a single meaningful choice about your own life." That particular truth had arrived for Prince Edward on a gray March morning, delivered in the calm, measured voice of Lord Alderton, Chief Royal Advisor, a man who had been delivering difficult news to the Ashford family for 40 years and had somehow made it look like a privilege. "Your father's condition has progressed," Lord Alderton said, standing at the far end of the mahogany table in the East Wing briefing room, his hands clasped behind his back like a man at a funeral. "The medical team believes it is no longer safe for him to carry out full royal duties. The transition will need to begin within the month." Edward had sat very still. Around him, aides and advisors murmured carefully. Someone slid a folder across the table. Inside it were timelines, press strategies, formal protocols, draft announcements. Someone had already written the announcement. Someone had already planned the press conference. Someone had already scheduled the moment his life would change forever, and done it all without asking him a single thing. "We understand this is a great deal to absorb," Lord Alderton continued. Edward looked up at him. "Do you?" The room went quiet. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. But the words had slipped past the wall of practiced composure he had been building and reinforcing since the age of 8, when his private tutor had sat across from him at a small desk and said, "A future king does not show weakness. Not to strangers, not to staff, and not to the press." He had been 8 years old. 8. "Forgive me," Edward said, smoothing his tie and reaching for the folder. "Please continue." He had driven himself, alone, which his security team had not appreciated, to Kensington Palace after the briefing ended, not because it was home in any meaningful sense of the word, but because it was the one place in London where he could close a door and not have someone immediately knock on it. He stood at the window of his private study and looked out at the Thames. The river moved the way it always did, steady, indifferent, unbothered by the ambitions and anxieties of the city on its banks. Edward had always found something comforting in that. The Thames had watched kings rise and fall for 1,000 years. It would watch him too, and it would not lose a moment's sleep over any of it. He was going to be king. He kept turning the sentence over in his mind, waiting to feel something conclusive. Pride, terror, resolve, anything. But what he found instead was a strange flat numbness, like reaching for a cup you expected to be hot and finding it empty. He was 31 years old. He had 2 degrees from Oxford, could speak 4 languages, had toured 26 countries in an official capacity, and had once memorized an entire 30-page speech on international trade policy in 48 hours because the scheduled speaker had fallen ill. He had done everything that had been asked of him, every single time it had been asked, without complaint and without deviation. And still, he could not shake the feeling that he had somehow arrived at the most significant moment of his life without ever having actually lived. He set the cold tea down on the windowsill. Outside, London carried on in the way that London always does, relentless, unsentimentally alive, full of people who had no idea a prince was watching them from a palace window and wondering what it would feel like to be one of them for just a single ordinary afternoon. He made a decision that surprised even himself. He rang his security detail, gave them a route and a cover story, He'd grown skilled at both, and 40 minutes later, he was walking along the Strand in a plain navy coat and a wool cap pulled low, looking for all the world like a moderately tall, somewhat serious man enjoying a Tuesday afternoon in London. It was the most freedom he'd felt in months. He found himself drifting south of Trafalgar Square, past the National Portrait Gallery, down toward the narrow lane of Cecil Court, that quiet, tucked-away stretch of antiquarian bookshops and print dealers that tourists sometimes stumbled into, and academics never seemed to leave. He had been here once before as a teenager with his mother. She had loved old books. She had loved the smell of them, the feel of their worn spines, the idea that someone else had held them and turned their pages and been changed by them. He was thinking about her when he heard the argument. It was not a loud argument exactly, but it was a passionate one. "Give it back," a woman's voice said, sharp and disbelieving. "I am not joking." "That is my scone," Edward turned. On the pavement outside a narrow blue-fronted bookshop, Hensley and Webb, Rare Books and Maps, read the faded gold lettering above the door. A young woman was engaged in a full and apparently serious negotiation with a pigeon. The pigeon had a significant portion of a cranberry scone clamped in its beak and was eyeing her with the particular brand of insolence that London pigeons have perfected over centuries of urban warfare. The woman had short dark hair, a paint-stained canvas bag hanging from one shoulder, and the expression of someone who had fully committed to winning this argument on principle alone. She was waving a paper bag at the bird with one hand and holding a keep cup of coffee in the other. "You did not just look me in the eye," she informed the pigeon. "You did not. I will not stand for this. I bought that scone at 7:30 this morning, and I have been saving it, and you have the absolute nerve." The pigeon flapped once, decisively, and relocated 6 feet to her left. She stared at it. She then looked up, possibly for witnesses, possibly for moral support, and found Edward standing on the pavement, watching her with an expression he had not worn in years. He was smiling, not the careful, practiced smile he deployed at state dinners and public engagements, not the warm but measured smile that the palace communications team had once described in an actual briefing document as approachable without compromising gravitas. This was a real smile, the kind that starts in the eyes before the mouth catches up. "Don't," she said, pointing at him with the paper bag. "I didn't say anything," he said. "You were about to. I was genuinely going to ask if you needed assistance." She looked at him, then at the pigeon, then back at him. "It's a pigeon," she said, "not a mugger. The distinction," Edward said, "seems to matter very little to your scone." She stared at him for a long moment, and then she laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, unscripted, the kind that doesn't ask permission, and something about it landed in the center of Edward's chest like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. "Clara," she said, extending her non-paper bag hand. "Clara Hensley." "Edward, that's..." shaking it. He almost said more. He almost said "Your Royal Highness" out of sheer habit, which would have been catastrophically funny. "Well, Edward," Clara said, tucking the paper bag under her arm and looking at him with the frank, unbothered curiosity of someone who had not spent 30 seconds wondering who he was. "Since you're here and clearly have nothing better to do you want to come in? I just got a delivery of 1930s travel maps, and I'm genuinely beside myself about it." He should have said no. He walked in. The inside of Hensley and Webb smelled like every good thing in the world: old paper, leather, something faintly floral, dried lavender maybe, tucked somewhere between the shelves. The shop was narrow and deep, the kind of space that seemed to stretch further back than the building's exterior could logically account for, with shelves running floor to ceiling on every wall and a rolling wooden ladder hooked to a brass rail that looked like it had been there since the shop was built. Maps were stacked in shallow wooden drawers beneath a central table. A fat ginger cat was asleep on a velvet chair near the window and showed absolutely no interest in their arrival. "That's Churchill," Clara said, dropping her bag on the counter and setting her coffee down. "He's been running this shop longer than I have. Don't pet him unless you want to renegotiate the terms of your visit." Edward glanced at the cat. "Noted. The maps are back here." She was already moving toward the back of the shop, pulling a thin gray coat off a hook and draping it over her shoulders without breaking stride. She had the energy of someone who was always slightly in the middle of something, always moving toward the next interesting thing. A woman in Hampstead had them, whole collection. Europe, North Africa, South America, all beautifully preserved. She said her grandfather bought them at auction in the 60s. She stopped at a low table near the back window, where a dozen or so large folded maps lay in careful stacks, each one wrapped in acid-free tissue. She peeled the tissue back on the first one with a gentleness that struck him as entirely at odds with the woman who had been arguing with a pigeon 7 minutes ago. The map was extraordinary. A 1932 cartographer's rendering of the African coastline, hand-drawn, with compass roses inked in burgundy and deep blue. The paper was warm and amber with age, but the lines were still crisp. "Look at this," Clara said, and her voice had changed, quieter now, almost reverent. "Someone sat down and made this, by hand, with ink and a steady eye and probably a very strong cup of tea. There were no satellites, no digital overlays. They just looked at the world and tried their absolute best to describe it accurately." Edward stood beside her, looking at the map. "It's remarkable," he said, and meant it in a way he rarely meant anything he said publicly. "People always say history is in museums." Clara smoothed a corner of the map with one careful finger. "But it's not, really. It's in things like this, in the things that ordinary people touched and used and cared about. Museums just freeze history. Things like this, these breathe." He looked at her rather than the map. She glanced up and caught him at it, and instead of looking away, she simply looked back, curious and unabashed. "What?" "Nothing," he said. You explain things well. Occupational habit," she said. "Half my job is convincing people that old things are worth caring about." She began refolding the tissue around the map. "What do you do?" He had an answer ready. He always had a cover answer ready. "Civil service," he said, which was technically, obliquely, in the broadest possible sense, not entirely untrue. "Glamorous," she said dryly. "Not especially. Do you like it?" It was such a simple question. It was the kind of question people asked each other every day, in pubs and at dinner parties and over coffee. The kind of question that had a perfectly standard answer ready and waiting. Yes, of course, very fulfilling. But standing in this particular bookshop, in this particular city, on this particular afternoon, Edward found that he could not make himself give the standard answer. "No," he said. Clara looked at him. "Then why do you do it?" "Because it's what I was born to do." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, that's a sad thing to say, is it?" "Yes." She moved to the next map in the stack. "People say that about jobs and careers, but being born to do something implies you never had a choice. That seems sad to me." He didn't answer that. He couldn't. Instead, he picked up one of the smaller maps, a 1934 street plan of London, Soho and Covent Garden, the street names unchanged but the city itself unrecognizable, and turned it over carefully in his hands. He spent 2 hours in that bookshop. 2 hours during which he talked more openly and more honestly than he had in years. Because Clara Hensley somehow had the remarkable quality of asking questions that were too genuine to dodge. She wasn't performing curiosity. She actually was curious about everything, about why he had been walking alone on Cecil Court, about what books he'd loved as a child, about whether he thought London had changed for better or worse in the past 20 years. She had opinions, strong ones, delivered without apology. She disagreed with him twice, clearly and without drama. She made him laugh 3 more times. She had no idea who he was. That fact sat at the back of his mind the entire time, uncomfortable and necessary. He was not naive enough to think that it didn't matter. It mattered enormously. But for 2 hours in a quiet bookshop that smelled of old paper and lavender, he was simply Edward, and she was simply Clara. And the conversation between them had the easy, rolling quality of something that had been waiting a long time to happen. When he finally said he had to go, she walked him to the door. "Thank you," he said, "for the maps." "You didn't buy any maps," she said. "For showing them to me, then." She smiled at him. It was not flirtatious, not calculated. It was just warm, direct. The kind of smile that meant, "I enjoyed this, and I am not pretending otherwise." "Come back when you want to buy one," she said. "I'll give you the civil servant discount." He walked back toward the main road where his car was waiting, and 2 things were happening simultaneously in his chest. Something was opening up, and something else was already beginning to hurt. He knew, with the precision of a man who had been trained to think clearly under pressure, exactly what was happening. He also knew, with the same precision, exactly why it could not happen. He rang his assistant from the car. "Clear my Thursday afternoon," he said. He was going back. By the 2nd week, Clara had taken to propping the shop door open when she was expecting him. She told herself it was because the lock was stiff, and she hated the sound it made when it caught, and that was at least partially true. She had been meaning to call a locksmith for 6 months. But the truth, the fuller and more unsettling truth, was that she had started listening for footsteps on the pavement outside, and she recognized his before she saw him. He had a particular walk, controlled but not stiff, the walk of someone who had spent years being looked at and had gotten very good at not appearing aware of it. She noticed things about people. It was unavoidable when you spent most of your working life with them, talking them through collections, reading their reactions to old things, watching what moved them and what left them cold. She had been running Hensley and Webb for 4 years since her father retired, And in that time, she had developed a near-involuntary habit of cataloging people. Edward was, as a subject, unusually difficult to read. He was careful, thoughtful in a way that seemed less like natural personality and more like something practiced, worn smooth over time. He chose his words with a precision that most people she knew didn't bother with. He listened, actually listened, without the restless, phone-checking half-attention that had become standard social currency. And he asked follow-up questions that proved he had been paying attention. But there were moments, brief ones, where something else surfaced. A look that lasted a fraction of a second too long before he composed himself. A pause before an answer that suggested the answer he gave and the answer he'd considered were two different things. She didn't push. She was not the pushing kind. But she noticed. On Thursday of the second week, he brought her coffee from the place on the Strand. Flat white, oat milk, no sugar, which she had mentioned in passing on his first visit and had not expected him to remember. He brought himself a black Americano, and they sat in the two chairs near the front window, the ones she usually reserved for browsers who needed somewhere to rest while they made up their minds. And they talked for 3 hours. He told her carefully, in the way he did everything, about growing up in a house where every room felt like a stage set. She told him about the year after her mother left, when she was 12, and how her father had dealt with it by buying more books, until the house was so full of them that grief didn't have anywhere comfortable to sit. He told her about the time he had been sent, at 15, on a 3-week diplomatic tour of Canada, and had spent the entire thing wondering what his school friends were doing at home. She told him about the summer she had saved for 6 months to buy a 1920s atlas of Southeast Asia, carried it home on the tube like a newborn, and then dropped it in a puddle outside her front door. He laughed at that one, a real, helpless laugh, and pressed his hand over his mouth like he'd surprised himself. "Don't," she said, grinning. It was devastating. "I know," he managed, still laughing. "I'm sorry. It's just the image." "I cried," she said. "I'm not ashamed to tell you that. You cried over an atlas. I cried over a rare, beautiful object that I had worked and saved for and then immediately destroyed through no fault of anyone except the London weather, which I stand by as a legitimate grievance." "You're right," he said, composing himself. "London weather is indefensible. Thank you. You're entirely right to hold it personally accountable." She threw a pen at him. He caught it without looking, reflexively, and they both went quiet for a moment, surprised. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was something happening between them that neither of them was naming. She was sensible enough to know what it was and experienced enough in the general category of complicated human feelings to understand that naming it would change things. She wasn't ready for things to change. She liked this, the coffee, the conversation, the sense that whatever this was existed outside the normal rules of time and expectation. But London, as Clara knew very well, keeps secrets badly. It started with one of her regular customers, a retired professor who came in every other Friday and always bought something in the category of antique military cartography. He had arrived just as Edward was leaving on the Thursday of week 3, and he had stopped on the pavement outside with his mouth slightly open and his eyes doing something Clara had never seen his eyes do before. "Was that?" he started. "No," Clara said firmly, taking him by the elbow and steering him toward the military map section. "Clara, I watch the news." "I'm not blind, that was." "Professor," she said, "I have a 1943 North African campaign map with your name on it. Shall we?" He bought the map. He did not bring up what he had seen again, at least not in the shop, but a week later there was a photograph. She found out about it the way most people found out about most things these days. Her phone lit up at 7:30 on a Wednesday morning with a message from her friend Priya. "Clara, Clara, I am looking at something on the internet right now, and I need you to call me immediately." She looked at the photograph. It had been taken from across the street. You could see through the window of the shop, her window, with the display of Victorian illustrated botanical guides she'd spent a whole afternoon arranging. And inside, seated in the two chairs by the window, were two people having coffee together. One of them was clearly her. The other one, the caption identified him as Prince Edward James Ashford, 31, heir to the British throne, was equally clearly Edward. She sat down on the edge of her bed. She read the caption again. Then she read it a third time. In case the first 2 times had been some sort of elaborate misunderstanding, they had not. She picked up her phone and called him. The number he'd given her went straight to a voicemail she'd never heard before. Formal, impersonal, nothing like his voice as she knew it. She ended the call without leaving a message. Then she opened her laptop and looked up Prince Edward Ashford. She did not stop reading for 40 minutes. When she finally closed the laptop, she sat for a long time in the early morning quiet of her flat above the shop, listening to London wake up outside. Buses, voices, the particular rhythm of a city that had been going about its complicated business for 1,000 years without waiting for anyone to catch up. Civil service, T had said. She pressed her fingers against her eyes and laughed once, without any real amusement. He had rehearsed the conversation 6 times in his head before he knocked on the door of the shop that Thursday. She opened it before his knuckles connected. She'd seen him coming, clearly, and stood in the doorway with her arms folded and an expression that was neither angry nor warm, but something more difficult. Carefully, deliberately calm. "You should probably come in," she said. He came in. The shop felt different. Or maybe he was different in it, now that the architecture of the whole thing had shifted. Churchill was still on the velvet chair. The maps were still in their shallow drawers. The lavender smell was still there. But the ease, that particular, impossible ease that had existed between them for the past 3 weeks, had gone somewhere he wasn't sure he could reach. "Clara, just," she held up a hand. "Let me say something first." He nodded. She moved behind the central table, which he understood immediately was intentional. She needed the physical distance, the wood between them, something solid to stand behind while she said what she needed to say. "I went through about 6 different emotions this morning," she said, "and I've done my best to work through all of them before you got here, because I didn't want to have this conversation while I was in the middle of any of the worst ones." She looked at him directly. "But I need you to understand that what I'm about to say is not easy for me to say." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize yet. You don't know what I'm going to say." He waited. "I'm not angry that you didn't tell me," she said. I think I understand why you didn't. And I know enough about your life from what I've been reading this morning to understand that walking into a bookshop and being no one for a few hours must have been, I don't know, necessary. Maybe the first real breath you'd taken in months." She paused. "Am I wrong?" "No," he said quietly. "You're not wrong." "Right." She looked at the table between them. "What I am is frightened, actually, which I didn't expect." She looked up. "I'm frightened because this, whatever this has been, has mattered to me. And now I'm standing here trying to figure out what it actually is, and the answer appears to be a thing that can't go anywhere. A thing that exists in a very beautiful, very temporary bubble that the world has now officially popped." Edward had not moved from the center of the shop. He was very still and very certain, in the way you are certain about the important things, the things that sit below your training and your composure and everything that has been built on top of the person you actually are, that he was not going to give the diplomatic answer. He was not going to manage this conversation. He was not going to say the careful, measured thing. "What if it wasn't temporary?" he said. She looked at him. "What if it wasn't a bubble?" he continued. "What if I told you that the last 3 weeks have been the first time in my adult life that I've felt like myself? Not the version of myself that exists in newspapers and briefing documents and state occasions, but me, the actual person underneath all of it. The one who laughs at pigeons and drinks black coffee and wants, genuinely wants, to know what books meant something to you as a child." He stopped. "What if I told you that the prospect of becoming king, of the rest of my life unfolding exactly the way it has been designed to unfold, has never frightened me the way it did before I walked into this shop?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. "Then I would say," she said carefully, "that you are describing a feeling. And feelings, Edward, are not plans. I know that. You are going to be king. I know that too. That is not a small thing." She uncrossed her arms and something in her posture changed, less defended, more tired, more truthful. "That is your entire life, structured, photographed, managed, official. And I am a woman who runs a bookshop on Cecil Court and cries over atlases and has a cat who doesn't follow instructions. We are not. The math doesn't work." "The math never works," he said, "when you're measuring the wrong things." She looked at him for a long time. "That is a very smooth line," she said. "It's not a line," he said. "I don't have lines. I have prepared remarks and diplomatic statements and press releases, and none of them are for this situation, so what you're getting is just me, unscripted, which I warn you I'm not very good at." "You're better at it than you think," she said, almost involuntarily. He crossed the room. He stopped on his side of the table, because she had put it there for a reason, and he respected that. But he was close enough now that the distance between them felt like a choice rather than a fact. "I'm not asking you to solve anything today," he said. "I'm not asking for a decision or a plan. I'm asking if you'll let me come back on Thursday with coffee, and whether we can be 2 people in a bookshop for a little longer while we work out what the rest of it looks like." Clara looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she looked at Churchill, who had opened one eye during the last 30 seconds and was now watching them both with the ancient, inscrutable calm of a creature who had observed considerable amounts of human drama and found it largely predictable. "Churchill," she said, "any thoughts?" Churchill closed his eye. "He's seen worse," she said. She walked around the side of the table. She did not take his hand or move close or do anything that could be photographed from across the street and captioned neatly for a morning edition. She simply stood on the same side of the table as him and looked up and said, "Thursday, flat white, oat milk, no sugar. And you're bringing the coffee this time." "I always bring the coffee," he said. "Good." She turned back toward the maps. "Now come and tell me what you think of this one." It's a 1938 map of the London Underground, pre-Jubilee line, pre-everything, and the colors are extraordinary. "I've been waiting 3 days to show someone." He stood beside her. Outside London went on being London, indifferent, magnificent, full of its own noise and history, and the 10,000 ordinary, irreplaceable stories playing out on every street. The Thames moved steadily south toward the sea. Somewhere across the city, in the east wing of a palace, a folder sat on a table with timelines and press strategies and everything already planned. But in a narrow bookshop on Cecil Court, a future king stood over a 1938 map of the city he was one day going to help lead. And for the first time in 31 years, the weight on his shoulders felt like something he might, with the right person standing beside him, learn to carry without disappearing beneath it. He looked at the map. He looked at her. He thought, whatever comes next, at least I will have had this. And then he thought, more quietly, more carefully, like a man who is only just beginning to believe he is allowed to want things. Maybe I don't have to stop at that. A crown can be inherited. A life must be chosen.